Hello, everyone. Welcome to Leading with Agility, the show that uses the world around us to explore how leadership can be inspired by agility. As always, I'm your host, Arif, and I'm joined by...
Myself, TK, not making any announcements in the rain from now on.
Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you so much, TK. And once again, thank you to all of our listeners. This is a landmark episode, TK. We've hit 20 episodes. So this is our 20th episode of this season. So
it's been a while, right? Which means 20 weeks that we've released. It's not a huge number, but definitely we had fun along the way and some great comments and listeners.
Yeah, and I'm hoping long may it continue. So if you've been sticking around with us this long, clearly we're doing something right. So thank you, as always, to all of you who tune in, download our latest episodes and give us your engagement. We really appreciate it. And well, we hope this episode does more to encourage you to stay with us even longer. So what are we talking about, TK? Well, hot off the press here in the UK, after months of speculation, the Prime Minister yesterday announced that there will be a general election on the 4th of July. So finally, a election being announced. And many polls in the UK are predicting that his party will lose by a significant margin, possibly even be wiped out in Parliament in terms of the number of seats.
I haven't seen one that isn't predicting that, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of predictions, but that's what the many analysts are predicting. And so I got thinking about some of this, and specifically about, as a leader, how should one react when you know the time is up, the game is up, and it's time for you to step down and move on?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I wanted to explore in today's episode. I'm thinking, what about the dynamics of leadership when success maybe isn't possible anymore? When do you, decide, okay, think I've done as much as I can now and I need to go, or the situation is changed and evolved so much that I can't be effective anymore. Do leaders continue sticking around? Should they resign?
They do, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they do all of these things. But I think there's plenty, to unpack here and explore and understand maybe why this happens. What should leaders do about it? How should they be thinking about these kind of questions? TK, what do you think?
And it happens for various reasons, and I'm really excited to talk about it because there's so many, leadership is one thing, but our own personality imprint is so important, and different people react differently to these situations, right? We've seen one person reacting. I remember the morning after the Brexit vote, Lord Cameron, not being the Lord at that time, resigned, and that's another, thing that happened outside 10 Downing Street. So different styles, different circumstances, different people, different reactions.
Definitely. Well, I think to start the conversation, maybe wind back a bit in terms of, how does a leader get to this point, maybe, or what happens in the preceding period before you get to this point, and way back in terms of even maybe taking a role on in the first place. Why do leaders take on particular roles? What is it about those roles that attract them to those positions? Now, you could argue, and you might say to me, TK, quite fairly, well, Arif, it isn't always about, taking on a role. Maybe you're just given a role, or a promotion is handed to you, or your role has changed. All of those factors are true. They all can happen. Generally speaking, I think I'm describing here is, when that position becomes available and you step into that, what is your motivating factor for taking that role in the first place? I just thought it'd be a nice place to start from the conversation and then expand onwards. I don't know if you had any immediate thoughts on all of that, TK, and then we can take the conversation forward from there.
It's interesting because, when someone has this leadership instinct, and, some people call them, naturally born leaders. I don't know if it exists or not.
Right.
What happens is when a person like that, and I've seen quite a few, and it's always quite funny, when a person like that is confronted with a rudderless situation, the natural instinct is to, I need to take charge because no one else does, right? And It's an interesting. My father is using an interesting example,
Okay.
which is from the world of seafarers, and when there's an emergency situation on a ship,
Yeah.
and you need to organize an evacuation, you need to go to a lifeboat, and so on.
Yeah.
A leader always emerges.
Yeah.
He always has this example that whatever happens when the situation calls for it, and it's quite an extreme situation in this case, a leader will very quickly emerge. That's just our human nature. So someone that has this gene trait will step in. Obviously, that's not the only motivation, but it's an interesting thing that naturally emerges in groups, especially when there's a need.
Yeah. That's I like your father's reflections. Thank you to him for his thoughts.
There's more when there came from.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. Maybe we'll get him on. I don't know. But you're right. I think that this notion of only certain people can take on this role. I agree, and there's probably I haven't got it in front of me, but there's probably enough academia that what's the word I'm looking for, doesn't promote that thinking, right? So yes. But I think just in terms of where I was asking the question, why take on a role in the first place? One of the things we talk about a lot is this idea of reflection, right? And an agile leader reflects. We say this quite often. This is another example, I think, where it's quite important. I mean, when you are either, as I said, falling into that position where you are going to take that leadership mantle on, and even let's take your father's example for a moment. As you said, someone steps forward, but there is a need that someone sees. There is a gap that someone observes that means they feel the need to, fill in that gap and take that leadership mantle on. Most often, especially in situations like you've described there, TK, they're doing it from a place of good intention. They're doing it in a place of service because they feel they have some skill or some attribute that can lend themselves positively to that situation at hand, right?
Or, yes, that's one way of putting it, but you could also say that, which is very interesting, and I've seen that, even I felt that myself sometimes, and also I've heard people talking about it. They're just getting annoyed that stuff isn't getting done.
Okay.
Not to mention, evacuating yourself from a, burning ship or something. But even as some of the listeners know, I'm getting my balcony renovated, and not everything is going accordingly to plan. But yet again, I feel like, okay, well, I will not harry these wonderful people, and I will let the project manager do his job, which maybe isn't the greatest job he's doing, renovating the balconies across
according
the whole building.
To you.
So, well, according to many of my neighbors, I would say, right?
Okay, fair enough.
I myself say, right, instead of stepping in and making a ruckus, I feel like, okay, I'm reflecting that, it's fine. I'm not an expert in construction. Let him do his job, because he probably knows more, and, we all make mistakes. But some people feel like the situation is so dire, or there's such a mess, that they're getting very annoyed and they're jumping in.
No, I can see that as a motivating factor, of course. But that's just another
with
form.
Good intentions.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's another form of acting in service, right? And with the right intention to improve a situation or to lend your skill in a positive way. Some of the reading I was doing before this episode, I came across some writing by a chap named Bill George, who's a professor of management practice at Harvard.
And he's easy to pronounce, yes?
Very easy to pronounce, yes. Unlike some of our previous...
I have to put a jingle for a difficult to pronounce professor or doctor or some other scholar, yes. Go ahead, I'll implement it next time.
No, that's fine. And he his thoughts chime very neatly to what we talk about, as I said, around an agile leader reflecting. Because his view is that when anyone takes on that leadership role, first thing they should ask themselves is, why do I want to lead? What is the reason for me wanting to take on that role? And more importantly, he says, what's the purpose of my leadership? I think that's a very insightful, self-reflective question. And I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that many leaders out there, and I'm sorry to say, if you are a leader out there, I would challenge you. Did you or make space, or did you ever consider those kind of questions when taking on whatever role you're in right now? You may have in some way, but was it a conscious process, or was it something that maybe you came to you afterwards, or some realizations happen further down the line? I think what we're talking about here is a conscious process of asking yourself these kind of reflective questions.
They're brilliant questions. Not being a contrarian myself, I think there's another process that pushes people to lead, because this would be like a good situation where you're becoming the leader, as you are said, with the appropriate intentions of making things better. But because leadership is associated quite often with high status in, well, dare I say, majority of situations, societies, and organizations, it becomes a question of ambition. Right? So you've got a situation where the opportunity presents itself, or you need to chase it, and you're motivated by, okay, well, if I want to get ahead in life or whatever, I need to step up and lead, right? That's a big motivation for many people. And thus, all these questions go to the wayside because, well, I'm either going to be shy and not take on the spotlight, or I will claim the destiny that's mine to claim. For many people, that unfortunately overshadows the beautiful questions that you've cited.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think if just a slight aside to what you're saying as well, TK, with these kind of questions and thoughts that the professor's asking leaders to consider, I think there's a hint from him, and doing some other reading as well, is that unfortunately what we find is that, and here in the UK, plenty of examples in public life, we can find them. In fact, partly I
we don't have to look far.
We don't have to look far. I mean, we can, whether you want to take the government or other institutions, right? You find that over time, leaders do sadly lose their way in terms of where they intended perhaps to do something positively impactful, or to add value in the right way, or came with good intentions. But over time, that has become sadly corrupted for various reasons, and their raison d'etre, or their reason for being in that role, it no longer is so clear as to what actual value they're adding, and are they a force for good in that position. So I think when you look at it from that perspective as well, it's not unreasonable to for people to question and say, okay, well, why are you actually in this role? And are you here for the right reasons? Some of the things he then goes on to describe to back this up is, in his view, rewards, bonuses, perks, stock options, whatever it might be, all of these things.
Status,
status, right? All of these things can, and it's not universal, of course, but it can have an effect on the motivating factor for a leader. Now, we're talking maybe very senior leaders, but whatever level, even if you're in the middle of an organization, as you said, TK, it could be status, it could be some power dynamic there as well. It could be anything. Wherever you are, these external gratification factors can influence a leader, so that they then lose their internal satisfaction factor. So they no longer are satisfied through, the work they're doing and the positive impact they're having. That isn't enough for them, but it is all the other external gratification that surrounds them. Is that where they're drawing their happiness from? And that's when we can have challenges and issues, I think.
Okay, that's quite interesting, right? I would definitely agree with that, and I've seen it many times. In fact, I would say that, for every leader, there comes a time where they need to shift and move, because, every environment needs some sort of freshness, iteration, reflection, even if it's like, maybe you need to figure out how to do succession planning in this case. And, times move quicker than you would expect. It's interesting also to maybe think about the motivating factors, as you said, because we get desensitized, right? We get used to the good things, to the bad ones too. So it's a natural human nature that we would seek more, that would motivate us. We are very adaptable creatures. That I think happens.
Yeah, no, and I think there's other aspects to this, which is when that behavior starts becoming more ingrained. This idea that we're now seeking all these external factors and motivating factors to keep us in our positions. It can also affect how we then, I suppose, take wise counsel or reject wise counsel. Okay. So what Professor also describes is that people who are around that person then aren't able to speak truth to power as much, because they are then, I suppose, set aside for maybe more sycophantic type individuals, right? Mm-hmm. People who will say what they want to hear and maybe are more interested in pleasing the leader for whatever they're doing, right? Rather than being there for the right reasons. So there's a lack of honest dialogue. There's a lack of challenge, provocation, in the right way, of course. So all of this, I know we're leading to something quite negative, perhaps, and it can lead to quite a toxic situation from a leadership point of view. But I think what can then happen is leaders then eventually lose their way, and then you get to a situation where they're maybe so blinded with their own situation, they can't see the impact they're creating and causing, so are not self-aware enough to say, you know what, it's time for me to leave. I'm not doing the right thing here. I'm not here for the right reasons, and I'm not here to serve the best interests of my employees, my organization, etc.
Yes, and it reminds me of a conversation I had with the leadership development director of a large corporation recently, when we both shared a particular view. So I'm not alone in thinking that, and he's also an expert. So I thought, both of us are thinking and seeing that, which is, he used a different name, but I call it senior leadership progression. Essentially what happens is that if someone's a senior leader, the weight of responsibility, and one would say a senior political leader, a statesperson is such a position, you will regress and become not okay. See, he used the word childlike, but you would see that many behaviors from such people can become irrational, because the amount of stress and pressure exerted on them will probably, and we've talked about the leadership circle before, make them go into the reactive space of leadership, which is more primal, and dare I say, less wise. So from that point of view, it's quite unsurprising that all these things that you've mentioned that eventually happen to senior leaders do happen, because one would say that's kind of strange that throughout history this particular phenomenon repeats itself, that it's a pattern. And since it's not it's not something productive, it should dissipate. And yet it repeats over and over again in different cultures, different positions, different people, probably because of that.
Fascinating. Interesting. I think maybe we'd take a break at this point and come back in a moment. So let's have a break, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you. Are you looking to expand your leadership knowledge? Well, join us for a live LinkedIn webinar on Tuesday, 18th June at 5 p.m. Together with our friends from Project 23, a leading UK DEI consultancy, we'll be hosting a panel discussion exploring how leaders must embrace their fears in order to stay relevant in today's workplace. Simply visit our website and scroll to the bottom of our homepage to register. And if you're listening to this episode after the event, you can catch all of our webinar recordings on our YouTube channel. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone, and thanks for sticking with the episode. Where were we before the break, TK? What were we
Well, we've
covering.
talked about the deterioration of a leader.
Yeah.
How it's difficult to keep yourself high performant, especially as a senior leader after some time has passed and you've been, well, I'm not saying
Institutionalized.
depleted, but yeah, well, that's a good one too. Yeah.
Yeah, institutionalized. I think
There you go. Well, many institutions have this effect.
they do.
I've been there.
Unfortunately. So let's move the conversation onwards. I think we, as you were saying there, that there's that view of institutionalization, etc. Another quote. Actually, no, I'll skip that. Let's move on then. I think and explore some of the other more wider reasons why you should even consider stepping down. Okay.
Okay.
As you said, TK, you could get into this place, as a leader where you've been there for so long. The environment's rubbing off on you. It's changing your behaviors. It's affecting how you're showing up and all of that, right? And we've described some of that, as I said, in the first half. But maybe there are other factors as well, right? There's going to be a range of things. And I think there are probably some questions one could ask themselves, or you could ask yourself, to assess whether or not, if you are in this kind of situation, okay, maybe it is the right time then. Maybe I do need to move on from where I am. I'm not serving my community, as in the people I'm working for, in the way I should. And so maybe I should hand the baton to someone else. Like you said earlier, TK, succession planning. And that is one of the things to consider. So I found this lovely essay by a lady named Janet Levinger. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Janet. She's an experienced board member and social impact leader. And when I say experienced board member, she's been on boards for decades by the looks of her profile. So she knows a thing or two about leadership and what it means to when to quit, essentially, when to step down. And so she's put together a range of questions that you should be asking yourself. One of the first ones is, firstly, what is the state of the organization you're in? So is your organization, in a strong position? And if there is stability in that organization based on the leadership around it, would that then, I suppose, mean you're more, it's more easier for you to step down because you've left things in a good place? And if it isn't, then what does that mean? Is it the right time? Because sometimes I think, organizations or leaders, in organizations maybe don't always consider or what's the word I'm looking for? Accept maybe that they are doing a good job and that they have had a positive impact and that their contribution has been meaningful. They find it difficult to accept that. They struggle with that. And so they don't realize the impact they've created. And so maybe make a rash decision or maybe feel, right, yeah, I'm not, this isn't for me. It's not working out because I'm not being as impactful as I want. I'm going to leave.
Mm-hmm.
So look around you is what she's suggesting, and consider the stability of the organization generally and the stability of leadership around you before you make that kind of decision.
Strong and stable, one of them said.
Exactly. The other thing she talks about is, which is, I think, to your point, TK, is this idea of succession planning. So if you are going to step down, then is there someone who is capable of stepping up? Is there someone who's going to, fill your boots, essentially, step in and do a good enough job? And I suppose that raises another question, which is how much of a responsibility is it for you to put succession planning in place? I think that's a very general question. I don't know, TK, what you want to say to that?
Well, I think, okay, so there's different situations. I can, for instance, talk about my own experience when, I felt a bit guilty leaving an organization myself, right? They've helped me grow a lot and, I wanted to go to pastures new. And I thought, well, I can't leave my boss team, this particular company without help in the area I've been dealing with. So, yeah, I've hired a team to replace me, which was interesting. People was like, why is he hiring these people? What's going on? I was like, and then I've, handed my resignation and they were like, Okay. Now we understand.
Yeah. But that I think that shows a responsible attitude to your role. You didn't take it for granted. You were interested in making sure that, everyone was clear-eyed as to what will happen when you left.
Well, I
And
guess, it's down to your personal values. But yeah.
it is, but I think that I would go further and say it is the leader's responsibility to put succession planning in place.
Yeah.
Because nobody else knows what needs to happen in your role better than you. And if you are a responsible person, then you'd make steps to make sure that happens, right? Someone who knows what they're doing fills the gap, essentially.
And what goes around comes around.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You don't want to be on the end of poor success. Someone's just left and dumped you in it, and then you've left to handle the reins.
I don't want to be, although I've been, yeah. So
exactly. The next thing she talks about, I think this is an interesting one as well, is we've all been places where there has been some kind of transformation effort, right? We've worked in organizations like that in the past quite a bit, TK. Prior to our lives as humble associates, co-founders.
So many lives, yes.
It's so many lives. And we've been in that same environment where, because of the shift of the organization going into a different direction in terms of, say, ways of working, or in terms of the type of work it does, or how it does its work, it means skill sets shift and skills and training needs all change. So where leaders may have been valued because of certain skills, it now means that the organization is looking for different skills. And so as a result, there is a question whether, as a leader, do you want to stay and retrain or recalibrate your style of work in order to fit that new model of work, or is it now time for you to step back, leave your position, and go to something else that maybe you find more enjoyable?
Yeah, and that's quite accurate. But as I'm thinking about these particular reasons, I just feel like possibly what is happening more often is the fact that there's different factors that play into this decision, which is, am I, as a leader, be able to be in a better position when I leave, right? People are, somewhat, it varies, self-centered and self-interested. And I think we can't possibly negate the fact that for many people, their particular circumstances, regardless of these questions, make up, an important reason for leaving or not, right? The availability of better places to be, better roles, other reasons. And as you've mentioned that, like, okay, a different skill, right? But I rarely see a leader saying, no, I'm not skilled in that. That's different. I'm just going to, quit. It's usually I might retire when the time comes, or, the organization should adapt to me, or maybe I'm slowly, silently quitting and looking for a different role. That happens more often.
I agree with you. One. I do agree with you, but I think that's the point of this conversation, I think, which is to really force that upfront thinking process for leaders out there, and maybe encourage a bit more, proactiveness in terms of how humble can you be, excuse the pun, but how humble to reflect constantly on your situation and whether you are there for the right reasons and whether you want to be there. Are you getting enjoyment? I mean, that is the obvious question to start with all of this, I suppose. Is the job still satisfying you? Is it enjoyable to you? Are you doing it because it fulfills some motivating purpose, right? So if that isn't being ticked, then why stick around, really?
Well, Arif, I think, I think it's a bit theoretical. I'll say that, when you look at the prime minister, he might not enjoy it, but he might feel the sense of responsibility. He might feel like a prestige, power. He might feel there's a lot of people relying on him, entire party. So in fact, even if, it's not the best thing, in terms of his job and he has to stay out there in the rain, there are probably other more important things that make him do that. Even though, and we've talked about burnout, for instance, with these things, they could probably really reflect on the fact and go where they want to go. Although I don't know if we're living in such a world, to be honest.
I know you're right. It is I think when it comes to things like politics and perhaps really high pressure business environments as well, there is, it does skew a lot more maybe to some of the stuff I mentioned in the earlier half of the podcast around the external gratification, right?
Yeah.
Sadly, we are in that world where that is, prevalent a lot more in some of these fields, okay? I wish it weren't the case. I'm sure you and our listeners would love that not to be the case, but we are there. I think for us doing this podcast and having these conversations, I really think it's important for us to raise these so that everyone has access to this thinking, has access to reconsider or constantly consider and reflect, and maybe use what we're saying as a tool to help you reflect and ask yourself these questions. I think that's what we're here for, TK, partly.
Quite true. And, there are some environments and organizations where this is possible. And I don't necessarily mean the post-scarcity society of Star Trek. As an example, I know a person that we're not in touch anymore, but I guess I should get back to her. She works in BT. And she changes her role regularly as a leader.
Okay.
And I said, well, that's interesting. You're moving to this new unit and so on and so forth. And she said, yeah, it's such a large organization that, the horizontal transfer is quite reasonably easy. And it was a good time for the company. So I'm taking this opportunity because I feel like I've done what I could in this particular situation. And the other roles are easily available for me to move into, right? So there's less friction. So in these circumstances, it absolutely can work, right? You could say that, a great leader should not have a problem in migrating to even another organization if they are truly able to reflect with such questions. I would say possibly it wouldn't be a problem for them at all.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, fair enough, TK. There's, lots of ways we can have this discussion and think about it and perspectives to come at it from. Back to the list that we were talking about of things that you want to be thinking about. Just a few more before we end today's episode. And I think I've mentioned this already, which is, are you just showing up to meetings and doing nothing else? Now, okay, I can see from her perspective as a board member, that's probably what a lot of board members do, turn to meetings, but they should be doing other things. So I'm sure that's what the intention of that question is. But the principle of that question, I think, is valuable still, which is presenteeism, essentially. As a leader, are you being present for the sake of being present, or are you proactively involved in supporting your team, whether it's, hand-holding them through challenges and situations, being proactive in asking the right questions and doing the work and unblocking them, or whatever, activities that you're expected, the strategizing bit, looking after, feeding and watering, whatever all those things are, right? Or are you just effectively showing up? So if you are in that position, then again, question to yourself, do you need to be there? Should you be there?
Do you want to be there?
Exactly.
I definitely have seen leaders in this set position, but I'm really enamored with the next question.
Go on.
Which is, have you accomplished what you wanted?
Exact. Good question.
That's I think the best from the list.
The key one, isn't it?
Yeah, because you have to know what you wanted to accomplish.
Well, and goes back to what we said at the start, which is, why have you taken the job on in the first place? Right. So if you haven't done that reflective piece, why are you here? What's the purpose of your leadership? What you're trying to get to? You're going to really struggle with this question. What have I accomplished? What was I here for? What was I meant to be doing here? It all sounds very simple, but I can imagine for many listeners out there or people who are listening who can relate because they see this in their own workplaces, perhaps with other leaders, you must be thinking to yourself, well, why can't they just do this?
Well, as a professional coach,
yes, TK,
when I'm asking questions like that,
yes.
If I took a photo of people's faces when they're confronted with a powerful and thought-provoking question like that, I would have a nice gallery. And, this is where the real thinking comes in, right? Oh, yeah, what do you want to accomplish in your role? It's like, or, why are you here? And again, as you said, Agile Leader reflects. So we should be asking ourselves these questions more often so we don't get this particular thinking phase when we need to reflect.
Exactly. Well, okay. I think another one that I like here, which just adds to that, is, are you blocking new ideas? Now, that's an interesting one, because I suspect for many listeners out, many leaders out there, I don't think they consciously are aware of them being a blocker. I suspect that for many, what they see is that they're just maintaining some kind of status quo, and possibly even don't want to see or not comfortable, with any change or disruption to how things are typically done. So if then someone approaches with new ideas, perhaps it's very easy for them to say, no, not important right now, not a focus. We're here to do this, and that's what I'm interested in. No time to consider what you're looking at right now. That kind of thing. I don't know, TK. What are your thoughts with that?
In fact, this question itself is a new idea, which people would block, right? Because this kind of reflection is obviously a new idea in itself. It's interesting in terms of, like, going back to the leadership circle. There are people that really value their competency and ideas that they have themselves. So any idea that comes in from outside their sphere will cause resentment, which is interesting, right? Because for some people, unfortunately, and it's not a tendency that I would think is productive, despite they would still resent new ideas, however long they stay in a role. But it's something separate. So that's an interesting one to reflect on, definitely.
Yeah, it is. Well, okay. I just I thought I pulled this quote out from something Janet said, and I think I'll share this quote and then maybe leave today's episode there. She said, I served on another board she served on boards for many years, 15 years, even as a board chair for 4 years. And she loved the organization and its mission, but she reached a point where she felt less engaged and her interests had evolved and she was busy with other things. She says, I was not offering as much, nor was I gaining as much for myself. I knew it was time to leave, and I did. There you go. So, folks, if you are in a position where you feel some of the things that we've discussed apply to you, then maybe time for some reflection and a consideration of your position and whether it's something you're still interested in and want to do. Or if you are aware of someone who is in this boat, maybe you want to share this podcast episode with them and help them do some reflection at the same time. TK, any last words or thoughts from you before we end the episode?
Yes. And if you feel like being in your role is motivated by your mortgage, you might want to join an organization like, I don't know if it's as good as I've said in BT still, but an organization that will provide you the job and economic security while still being able to not stay in the same place for too long. That's also an option, a practical one.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for listening. Thank you for being engaged and being present throughout our episode today. We hope you enjoyed it. As always, please do like or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player, wherever you're listening from. And if you haven't already, we'd appreciate a review. It always helps us with the algorithms.
Always does.
Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.